It is said that one evening in Paris, when the gas lamps along the boulevards burned dim with the fog of late autumn, a whisper passed from salon to salon. Sarah-Bernhardt, the woman hailed across continents as the very embodiment of the stage, had once more retreated into her coffin. Not as a corpse, though many thought her already half in league with the shadows, but as a dreamer, rehearsing the silence of death. The story unsettled her friends, delighted her critics, and became another thread in the tapestry of her legend, where art and existence entwined until neither could be told apart. Welcome, dear listener, to this long remembrance of a life that was lived, not quietly, but with a brilliance so piercing it has left its mark upon more than 1 century. Before we begin, may I ask you something gentle? Tell us in the comments where you are listening from and at what time of day these words have reached you. In this way, each voice becomes part of a global memory network, a constellation of listeners stretched across lands and oceans. And if you wish this circle to grow stronger, I invite you to press the button of subscription so that these echoes of history may continue to flow towards you. Now let us begin. The sound of bells once filled the narrow Parisian streets where Sarah-Bernhardt was born in 1844, though the record of her arrival is cloaked in uncertainty. Even her birth certificate remains contested, with whispers of different dates and shadows around her father's identity. Some said she was the daughter of a wealthy lawyer. Others insisted upon more elusive names. Her mother, Julie, was a Dutch courtesan, graceful and independent, who lived amidst the gilded chambers of Parisian society, but also on its margins. From the beginning, Sarah stood at the crossroads of legitimacy and scandal, claimed and yet unclaimed, loved and yet half abandoned. In the flicker of that ambiguity, her future seemed already carved. She was a child of frailty. Stories describe her as thin, pale, prone to fevers that left her body trembling like a candle flame in a draught. Perhaps it was this fragility that gave her presence such intensity later, for she learned early how to survive through force of spirit rather than strength of limb. Some said she gazed with eyes too large for her face, as if already searching beyond the boundaries of her time. And when she was sent to a convent for her education, she entered not as one eager to submit, but as a spirit both restless and observant. The cloisters were filled with the murmur of prayer, the scent of wax and incense, the cool touch of stone beneath the hand. There, surrounded by discipline, she first tasted the silence that would later haunt her and the rhythm of ritual that would echo in her art. The nuns spoke of her wildness, yet also of her intensity in prayer. One tale recounts how, during a mass, she became so absorbed in the music of the choir that tears streamed down her cheeks, her body swaying as if seized by an unseen force. Others found her disobedient, too quick to argue, too ready to wander into corners where contemplation was not permitted. And still, she endured. Was she already rehearsing the dual nature that would define her life? Obedient and rebellious, sacred and scandalous, fragile and indestructible? These contradictions, like threads of different color, began weaving themselves into her being long before the world knew her name. The convent also taught her of performance. Festivals and school plays gave the girls opportunities to embody saints and angels, martyrs and prophets. Sarah, with her luminous eyes and fervent spirit, stood out in such roles. She had not yet found the golden voice that would shake theaters from Paris to New York, but the seeds were planted. Perhaps it was then that she discovered what power could be found in words spoken aloud, in gestures charged with unseen meaning. It is said that after one such play, a visiting family friend whispered that the girl was destined for the stage, though in that era to suggest such a future was not always a blessing. The theater, like the convent, carried both sanctity and scandal. It was a space of reverence and danger, devotion and temptation. Could it be that in these paradoxes, Sarah felt at home? Her health remained uncertain, Letters from the time describe her fainting fits, her spells of weakness, her need for rest when other children ran without care. Yet alongside the frailty there was an iron thread of determination. She insisted upon her place, upon her right to be seen. If denied, she grew furious. If scolded, she answered with a defiance beyond her years. This determination, wedded to her fragility, gave her an aura both magnetic and unsettling. People saw in her not merely a child, but a possibility, as if she carried within her the echoes of something older, something waiting to unfold. One cannot help but wonder, did she even then sense the coffin's embrace? For a child who lived in half-light between convent shadows and uncertain family affections, the idea of resting within the stillness of death may not have seemed as foreign as it does to us. Perhaps she longed for it as a space where ambiguity would dissolve, where she would finally be complete. Or perhaps she already sensed the drama of such an image, how others would speak of it in awe and dismay. The coffin was not yet in her possession, but the imagination of it may already have whispered through her nights. Her mother, meanwhile, lived at a distance. Julie Bernhardt was not the nurturing figure some children find at their side. She moved in circles of wealth and desire, attached to influential men, often absent from her daughter's days. This absence deepened Sarah's sense of isolation. A child of uncertain paternity and of a mother whose affections were divided, she grew accustomed to being at once cherished and neglected. This duality, desired yet denied, became another wound, but also another force shaping her path. It may explain why, later in life, she pursued love with such abandon, with such disregard for consequence, as though she were always reaching for the affection that eluded her in childhood. And so the girl walked through convent corridors, the bells tolling above, the air smelling of chalk and damp stone, the quiet footsteps of sisters echoing along the halls. Each day, lessons of obedience were pressed upon her, but each night, perhaps, she dreamed of a life where she would command attention rather than submit to it. In the fragile child with pale cheeks and restless eyes, the seeds of a future storm had already taken root. The world would one day know her as the divine monster, but at that time she was only Sarah, uncertain, fragile, and waiting. The bells that marked her days grew louder in memory, for they signaled not just the hours of prayer, but also the passage of time toward her destiny. Each toll seemed to mark a step closer to the stage, though she did not yet know it. Each vibration shuddered through her body, as if preparing her for the resonance of her own voice that would later shake audiences to their core. The convent bells, like unseen heralds, carried her toward the world she would one day astonish. And when the bells faded into the night, when the cloisters grew dark and silent, there remained within her a sense of absence, of waiting. She did not yet know what she was waiting for, but she felt it keenly. Perhaps that is what shaped her earliest performances. Not the desire to display, but the desire to fill the emptiness within. And in doing so, she began the long journey of filling the emptiness of others, the audiences who would flock to her in search of meaning, of intensity, of the mystery that only she seemed able to summon. And so, we leave her there, in the convent's half-light, the bells still ringing in memory, the scent of wax and stone lingering in the air, her fragile frame holding within it a fire that had not yet found its flame. The bells still reverberated in her memory as Sarah stepped beyond the convent walls and into the broader air of Paris. They seemed to echo in her bones, a private music no one else could hear, shaping the rhythm of her early days as she crossed into the uncertain terrain of youth. Paris in the mid-19th century was not a city of uniform calm, but of contrast. Narrow streets of poverty set against boulevards gilded with gaslight, the murmur of revolution never far from its corners, the perfume of luxury drifting alongside the scent of mud and horse. Into this world Sarah carried both her fragility and her hidden fire. She was still pale, still uncertain in body, but already the seed of ambition pressed against her ribs like something waiting to be born. It was through the threads of her mother's connections that she found herself directed to the Conservatoire, that hallowed school where the future voices of France were trained in the strict disciplines of art. The idea came not from Sarah's own desire, but from those around her who wondered what to do with this restless child. Her mother, distant but ambitious, saw the possibility of transforming her daughter's peculiar energy into something profitable, while friends of the family murmured that such a path might offer both discipline and fame. And so Sarah, barely more than a girl, entered the doors of the Conservatoire in 1859, her fragile frame wrapped in a mixture of fear and defiance, her large eyes searching the halls lined with marble busts and the faint smell of chalk and candle smoke. The Conservatoire was no convent. Where once the rhythm of bells dictated her days, now it was the rhythm of voice exercises, declamations, and the stern gaze of instructors. The halls echoed with recitations of Racine and Corneille, with the precise cadence of verse, with the discipline of breathing and gesture. Sarah was expected to submit to structure, to align herself with the traditions of the French stage, to erase her own peculiarities in order to embody the classical ideal. And yet, within her there stirred a resistance. Her voice, still unformed, carried a peculiar timbre that instructors found unsettling. Some said it was too harsh, too nasal, too unconventional. Others glimpsed within it a strange quality, as though gold shimmered beneath rough stone. Sarah, however, struggled to conform. The strictures of the Conservatoire pressed upon her as heavily as the cloister's silence once had. But resistance was not weakness. She learned quickly, though not always in the way her teachers desired. She absorbed the cadence of verse, the placement of breath, the demands of gesture, yet she bent them toward her own peculiar rhythm. Where others imitated, she transformed. Where others submitted, she resisted. Her instructors, exasperated, scolded her often. Yet there were moments when her voice, even in its unpolished state, pierced through the hall with a resonance that silenced criticism. It was as if she carried within her the echo of something older, something unteachable, something that could not be contained by rule. In those early days, Sarah performed in student productions, her frame still slight, her presence unsteady. She trembled before audiences, her hands cold, her voice sometimes faltering, yet there was always a spark, a sudden illumination that drew the eye toward her. Observers remarked upon it, though they could not yet name it. Some thought it an illusion, a trick of the light, a fleeting impression. Others felt a shiver, as if encountering a force not entirely of this world. Sarah herself seemed unaware of the effect she created, struggling only to remember her lines, to steady her breath, to survive the judgment of teachers and peers. And yet, within these tremors, the foundations of her legend were being laid. The Conservatoire demanded uniformity, but Sarah began to sense that her strength lay in difference. She could not be the polished, perfect image of classical French grace. Her voice would not submit to the clear, crystalline tones her teachers prized. Instead, it carried shadows, depths, a peculiar vibration that hinted at both vulnerability and strength. This duality unsettled her instructors, who labeled her difficult, perhaps even unsuited for the stage. Yet it was precisely this difficulty, this refusal to fit, that would one day make her unforgettable. Still, these were years of struggle. She felt isolated, often mocked by fellow students, criticized by teachers who found her too unruly. She spent long hours in her small room, rehearsing lines until her throat ached, studying gestures before the mirror, battling the sense of inadequacy that threatened to overwhelm her. And yet, each failure seemed only to deepen her resolve. Like the bells of the convent that had once tolled in her ears, the rhythm of her ambition sounded within her, urging her forward. She would not surrender, though her path was filled with uncertainty. One story tells of a moment during rehearsal when Sarah, tasked with a minor role, suddenly broke from the prescribed delivery and spoke her lines with a raw intensity that startled both teachers and students. The words, simple on the page, became in her mouth a cry that seemed to pierce the air with anguish. For an instant the room fell silent, as if all present felt something of their own hidden sorrows laid bare. The spell was broken by scolding, by reminders to follow the rules, but the impression lingered. In that moment, Sarah discovered that art was not only about technique, but about summoning the hidden shadows of the soul. It was a discovery she would never forget. And so her days at the conservatoire unfolded, a mixture of scolding and inspiration, of trembling failures and sudden flashes of brilliance. She remained uncertain in health, prone to fainting, her body fragile against the demands of training. Yet her spirit burned fiercer with each challenge. The girl who had once wandered convent halls in restless contemplation now wandered the halls of the conservatoire, carrying within her a sense of destiny that even she could not fully name. Paris itself seemed to feed her ambition. The city was alive with art, with revolution, with the clash of ideas. Painters, writers, and musicians filled the cafes, debating until dawn, while the theaters echoed with performances that stirred the soul. Sarah, still a student, felt herself drawn to this wider world. She slipped into theaters, watched plays with hungry eyes, absorbed every gesture, every tone. She sensed that her place was not only within the walls of the conservatoire, but within the living theater of Paris itself. She longed not only to learn, but to be seen, to claim her place upon the stage of history. Yet recognition remained distant. Her teachers doubted her. Critics would later dismiss her first performances. Even among her fellow students, she was not considered exceptional. But Sarah carried within her the secret knowledge of her own fire, a knowledge that perhaps even she did not fully understand, but which drove her forward against every doubt. She knew, somehow, that the bells that had once tolled over her childhood would not fade into silence. They would one day resound in the applause of audiences across the world. And so she waited, uncertain yet determined, trembling yet unyielding. The conservatoire shaped her, but it could not contain her. Within its walls, she discovered not only the tools of her craft, but also the defiance that would make her legendary. The tremor of her first performances, the golden thread hidden within her imperfect voice, the resistance to conformity, these became the foundation of all that followed. She was still a student, still fragile, still doubted. But the stage had already claimed her, and her destiny had already begun to unfold. The murmurs of the conservatoire, the scolding of teachers, the laughter of fellow students, all these sounds faded into silence as the curtain of her first true performance began to rise. And with it, the hush of an audience waiting, the breath held before judgment, the silence that trembles before it breaks. The silence before judgment stretched long and thin as Sarah stepped onto the stage of the Comédie-Française in 1862, a girl of 17, fragile as porcelain yet burning with the restless force of destiny. The hush of the audience seemed to press against her chest, and when she opened her lips to speak, the tremor of her voice carried not only the lines of Racine, but also the weight of her own uncertainty. The curtain had risen not just on a play, but on a trial. The theater was vast compared to the smaller halls of the conservatoire, its chandeliers throwing down sharp light, its velvet seats filled with eyes trained to dissect every gesture. In that moment, Sarah was no longer merely a student, but a novice before the altar of an exacting god, the French stage. Her performance did not soar. The words stumbled. The gestures lacked confidence. Critics and fellow actors found her awkward, too thin, too frail to carry the grandeur of classical roles. Her voice, though strange and promising, struck many as unnatural, its timbre at odds with the polished tones they revered, and so laughter and scorn found their way into the air where she had hoped for reverence. A curtain falls heavily when weighed down by disapproval, and in Sarah's case, it fell not only on her performance, but upon her confidence. The first taste of failure is bitter, and she swallowed it with the determination of one who has no other path to walk. The Comédie-Française, that grand institution, was not a kind mother. Its traditions were iron-bound, its actors a hierarchy of prestige and rivalry. Sarah, young and untested, found little welcome among them. Her colleagues mocked her slight frame and sharp features, calling her the little skeleton, whispering doubts about her future. Even in rehearsal, she struggled to command respect. She was not yet the divine monster, only a pale girl pushing against walls too high for her reach. Yet in her defiance she endured, clinging to each role with a desperate grip, as though each line spoken was a lifeline stretched across a chasm. It was during this period that her notorious temper revealed itself. One story tells of an incident when she accidentally stepped on the train of a senior actress's gown. The actress, insulted, slapped her. Sarah, rather than bowing her head, slapped her back. In that moment, scandal burst through the quiet halls of the Comédie-Française. To strike a senior, to defy the hierarchy so openly, was unthinkable. Sarah's fate seemed sealed in disgrace. She was suspended, her reputation tarnished before it had even been established. Yet within that act of defiance lay a glimpse of the woman she would become. Unwilling to yield, unwilling to bow, even if it meant exile. She drifted through this period in uncertainty. Her performances failed to catch fire, her colleagues dismissed her, and her family offered little support. There were moments when the temptation to surrender must have been strong, to walk away from a stage that seemed determined to reject her. And yet, even in failure, the stage held her in its grasp. She had tasted its silence, its peril, and even in rejection she could not turn away. The theater had already become her coffin, both refuge and prison, a space where she rehearsed not only her art, but her identity. At times, she found herself wandering the streets of Paris, the fog settling on her thin shoulders, the sound of carriages rolling over cobblestones like distant thunder. She must have felt herself a ghost, half alive, half banished, searching for the place where her fire could ignite. And in those wanderings, did she perhaps begin to understand that her path would never be one of acceptance, but of defiance? That her voice, strange and golden, would never belong to the polite traditions of the Comédie-Française, but to a broader, more unruly stage, the world itself? Her failures, though bitter, planted seeds of resilience. Each jeer, each dismissal, each curtain falling with the weight of disapproval became fuel for her determination. She would not surrender. She would take her voice, her strangeness, her very frailty, and turn them into weapons. But at that moment she was still a novice in exile, her fire unrecognized, her coffin still empty. It is said that the first great defeat is the true crucible of genius. For Sarah, these early years at the Comédie-Française were the hammer blows that tempered her into something stronger than mere talent. The failures did not crush her, they refined her. The ridicule did not silence her, it gave her a reason to shout louder. The stage, in rejecting her, bound her to itself more tightly, as if saying, "You will not leave me, and I will not let you go." And so the curtain fell again and again, heavy with disapproval, yet each fall became a rehearsal for endurance. Each tremor of failure prepared her for the roar of applause that would one day rise in its place. At 17, Sarah-Bernhardt had tasted the bitterness of rejection, and in that bitterness she found the first true test of her destiny, The curtain fell, and with it silence filled the hall, a silence heavy not with reverence but with dismissal. Yet silence, as Sarah would one day discover, is not the end. It is only the pause before the next act begins. The silence after the curtain's fall lingered like a weight in the chest, a silence not of awe, but of dismissal. Sarah carried it with her as she stepped away from the grand stage of the Comédie-Française, its heavy doors closing behind her, as though barring her from the sanctuary of tradition. Yet silence, however heavy, is never permanent. Within it, faint sounds begin to stir, as when a seed beneath the soil pushes unseen against the earth, preparing its unseen bloom. For Sarah, that silence became the threshold of resilience. She did not return in triumph. Rather, she wandered in the shadows of Paris, taking what roles she could, enduring whispers of failure and disgrace. Her name was tarnished in certain circles, her youth mocked, her presence dismissed. But the theater does not easily release those who have once tasted its peril and its promise. Soon, Sarah found herself drawn to the Odéon, the more modest theater that stood apart from the solemn grandeur of the Comédie-Française. There, the air was less stiff, the traditions less heavy. It was a place where experimentation could breathe, where young actors might attempt what the guardians of classical purity forbade. And in that freer space, Sarah began to find her footing once more. The Odéon was not grand, but it had its own atmosphere. Dust rising from the old curtains, the smell of candle wax mingling with damp stone, the faint murmur of audiences more willing to be surprised. Sarah, still thin and fragile, stepped onto its stage with both fear and defiance. Her early performances here were not flawless. She still trembled, still faltered, still bore the scars of failure. But something had shifted within her. She no longer sought merely to please her teachers or colleagues. She sought instead to claim her own truth, however strange it might appear to others. It was here that her intensity began to reveal itself more fully. Audiences, though not always charmed, began to sense a peculiar magnetism in her. She was not graceful in the conventional way, nor was her voice the polished instrument of her peers. Yet there was a force that pulled the eye toward her, an emotional current that seemed to break through the polished mask of theater and reveal something raw beneath. She could not be ignored, and in that refusal to be ignored, she began to build her legend. One performance in particular began to change her fortunes. In 1866, she took part in the revival of Kean, a play about the tragic genius of an English actor undone by his own excess. The role, though not the grandest, allowed Sarah to inhabit the restless spirit of an artist tormented by his gift. The audience, watching her fragile figure tremble with passion, could not help but feel a strange recognition. Here was a young actress who seemed to embody the very struggle of art itself, the longing, the despair, the fire that consumed. For the first time, applause rose not merely out of courtesy, but out of genuine feeling. The Odéon gave her more chances. She began to inhabit roles of suffering women, of tragic heroines, of spirits caught between life and death. And in these roles she found a mirror for her own restless being. Each time she stepped onto the stage, it was as though she carried with her not only the script, but the shadows of her own life, the uncertain parentage, the convent's bells, the scorn of the Comédie-Française. The audience may not have known the details, but they felt the intensity. It was this capacity to transmute personal wound into universal expression that set her apart. Her resilience was not only artistic, but personal. She worked tirelessly, rehearsing long hours, studying gestures before the mirror, testing the limits of her fragile health. At the same time, she began to cultivate a life beyond the stage that shocked and fascinated her contemporaries. She moved through Parisian salons with a boldness that defied her failures, gathering friends, lovers, and patrons. Even those who mocked her could not deny her presence. She was beginning to understand that her legend would not be built on conformity, but on audacity. The Odéon became her crucible, a place where failure was transfigured into new strength. Yet she did not escape tragedy. In 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, the theater was set ablaze during the siege of Paris. Flames consumed its wooden beams, smoke rose into the sky, and the stage that had nurtured her first triumphs collapsed into ruin. Sarah, watching the destruction, must have felt a pang deeper than the loss of a building. It was as if the place that had given her rebirth was itself sacrificed to the chaos of history. Yet even in ruin, she refused despair. She opened her home as a hospital for wounded soldiers, tending to them with the same intensity she once gave to her roles. Once again, her fragility revealed itself as strength. The world began to take notice. No longer merely the failed novice of the Comédie-Française, Sarah-Bernhardt was becoming a name whispered in admiration as well as scandal. She was not yet the divine monster, but the shape of that legend was forming in the dust and smoke of the Odéon. The resilience she forged here would carry her through the greater stages of Europe and America, through scandals and triumphs, through illness and immortality. And so the curtain of the Odéon fell upon her with greater gentleness than that of the Comédie-Française. The applause, though not yet thunderous, was steady, and within it Sarah heard the faint promise of the destiny she had always carried. Dust and candle wax lingered in the air, mingling with the echo of voices and the faint creak of old wood. It was not grandeur, but it was enough. The silence of rejection had been broken, and in its place a new murmur had begun. The smell of dust and candle wax filled her lungs, clinging to her hair and clothes as she stepped into the night. That scent would linger with her, not as ruin, but as a reminder of resilience, the air of a theater where her fire first began to burn. The smell of dust and candle wax still clung to her clothes as she stepped out of the Odéon into the restless pulse of Paris. Yet beyond the theater doors, another stage awaited her, one made not of velvet curtains and painted scenery, but of salons lit by crystal chandeliers, where silk whispered in shadowed corners and the games of desire unfolded with as much drama as any tragedy of Racine. Here, Sarah began to weave her legend anew, not only through her roles upon the stage, but through the scandalous defiance of her private life. Paris in those years was a city of both elegance and hunger, of empire and unease. The salons of the wealthy flickered with candlelight, filled with perfume and murmured confidences, while outside, the cobblestones echoed with the footsteps of soldiers and beggars alike. Sarah, with her fragile figure and luminous eyes, slipped easily into these salons, yet she was never merely a guest. She was an intrusion, a force, unsettling in her refusal to play by the rules. She was not shy in her affections. Lovers came and went, drawn to her intensity, her quicksilver moods, her magnetic presence. Among them were aristocrats, artists and soldiers, men who might have preferred a more docile companion, but who found themselves ensnared in the dangerous thrill of her company. Sarah did not hide these affairs, nor did she apologize for them. In a society that demanded women's modesty and submission, her openness was scandal itself. Yet it was this same audacity that made her irresistible. She lived as though love were another role to be performed with total abandon, and she played it to the full, regardless of consequence. In 1864, her son Maurice was born, the result of an affair with a Belgian nobleman. She did not conceal his birth, nor did she retreat into shame. Instead, she raised him as her own, refusing the security of marriage that might have soothed society's judgment. For Sarah, love and motherhood were not chains but choices, and she embraced them on her own terms. In this she defied not only convention, but also the lingering wounds of her own childhood. where absence and uncertainty had marked her earliest years. By claiming her son openly, she reversed the pattern, giving him what she herself had long been denied, a name bound not to secrecy, but to courage. The salons whispered. They called her reckless, shameless, impossible. Yet these same whispers ensured that her name spread beyond the walls of the theater. She became not only an actress, but a figure of fascination, her private life as compelling to audiences as her performances. Some critics dismissed her art, claiming her fame rested only on scandal. Others, however, sensed that the two could not be separated. For Sarah, art and life were one. The same fire that burned upon the stage burned in her loves, her choices, her very defiance of society's rules. There were moments when scandal brought real consequence. Patrons withdrew support, critics sharpened their pens, rivals used her affairs to tarnish her reputation. Yet Sarah endured as she always had, turning even disgrace into fuel. She seemed to understand that notoriety could be as powerful as acclaim, that to be spoken of, even in scandal, was better than to be forgotten. Her very survival as an actress depended on being unforgettable, and so she embraced the danger of excess. Her lovers, too, fed her legend. Some were destroyed by her intensity, unable to withstand the force of her demands. Others lingered only briefly, like candles burned too quickly to ash. Yet Sarah moved on, unbroken, seeking always the next flame. She seemed less in search of comfort than of experience, less in search of security than of the vividness of living. Love for her was not a safe harbor, but a storm, and she welcomed its lightning as though it were part of the same energy that surged through her performances. One might wonder whether these affairs filled the emptiness that haunted her, the emptiness left by an absent father and a distant mother, or did they merely echo it, reminding her again and again of the impossibility of satisfaction? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps her lovers gave her glimpses of completion that faded as quickly as applause, leaving her always hungry, always restless, always turning to the next embrace as to the next role. In this she was both tragic and triumphant, living with an honesty that few dared, but paying the price of perpetual longing. The rustle of silk in those salons, the scent of perfume mingling with candlelight, the whispers of admiration and scandal, they were as much a part of her stage as the boards of the Odéon. She moved between them with ease, transforming each setting into a theater, each encounter into a performance. Yet in this blurring of art and life, where did Sarah end and the legend begin? Could she herself tell the difference, or had she already become the divine monster whose truth was indistinguishable from her mask? And so, in the salons, as on the stage, Sarah's legend grew. Her affairs shocked, her defiance unsettled, her choices inspired both admiration and condemnation. But all the while, her art deepened. For every embrace, every scandal, every whispered judgment became another layer of experience, another wound or ecstasy to be transmuted into performance. When she stepped upon the stage, audiences felt in her voice not only the lines of the playwright, but the weight of lived passion. This was her gift, to turn her own unruly life into the raw material of art, so that her characters were not distant fictions but mirrors of her own restless soul. The rustle of silk lingered as she left the salons, stepping once more into the cool night air of Paris. Somewhere behind her, whispers still fluttered like moths around the flame of her name. Yet before her lay the stage, waiting, patient, its dust and shadows promising a different kind of intoxication. The applause would rise again, fierce and uncertain, but first came the silence, the breath before the voice, the moment before the golden tone unfurled. And in that silence she paused, her figure still and listening. The salons had given her scandal, love, and whispers. The stage would give her something else, the roar of recognition. But for now, only the faint rustle of silk remained, fading into the dark. The rustle of silk faded into the dark, leaving only the cool hush of night. Yet in that hush, another sound soon began to rise, the murmur of audiences gathering, the shuffling of feet in crowded theaters, the creak of wooden seats as men and women leaned forward with expectation. Sarah, having passed through the silence of failure and the whispers of scandal, now stood at the threshold of recognition. The time had come for her voice, strange and golden, to claim its rightful place. It was in the later years of the 1860s, upon the stage of the Odéon, that she began to shine with a light no scorn could dim. The plays of Victor Hugo and other dramatists of passion and tragedy offered her characters that seemed shaped for her own restless nature. When she played the doomed heroines, the broken lovers, the women crushed by fate, yet radiant in defiance, audiences felt that she was not acting but living. They saw in her not only the gestures of art, but the trembling of a soul. Her thin frame, once mocked as skeletal, now seemed the very embodiment of tragic delicacy, a body too slight for the force that surged within it. Her voice, once criticized as harsh, revealed itself as an instrument of haunting resonance. It carried not merely words, but emotion, an intensity that unsettled even as it enthralled. One of her earliest triumphs came with Hugo's Ruy Blas, where she played the Queen of Spain. Her entrance upon the stage was described as a vision, fragile, luminous, her every movement alive with restrained fire. Critics who had once dismissed her now wrote of her with awe, describing how she made even silence eloquent, how a mere glance from her eyes could command the theater more powerfully than another's grandest declamation. It was not perfection they praised, but a quality beyond perfection, a raw immediacy, a living truth that seemed to shatter the polished masks of tradition. And then came Phèdre, Racine's queen of burning desire and fatal guilt. Here, Sarah's peculiar gifts found their purest expression. In her, Phèdre was not merely a mythic figure of Greek tragedy, but a woman consumed by longing, trembling on the edge of collapse. Audiences watched her body quiver, her breath break, her voice plunge from golden resonance into whispers of despair. Some said she seemed to dissolve upon the stage, to become more spirit than flesh. Others confessed that she disturbed them, for she revealed passions they themselves had buried. Applause rose like a storm, not only for her technique, but for the shudder of recognition she inspired. It was as if she had torn aside the veil that separates art from life, forcing all who watched to confront their own secret shadows. Her fame spread quickly. Newspapers wrote of her with fascination, calling her not simply an actress, but a phenomenon. Painters sought to capture her likeness, poets to describe her voice. Paris, so quick to mock, now bowed before her with admiration. And beyond Paris, the name of Sarah-Bernhardt began to carry across Europe, whispered in Vienna, Berlin, London. She was no longer merely a figure of scandalous salons, but a star whose light crossed borders. Yet acclaim brought its own weight. Success demanded repetition, demanded that she embody again and again the intensity that had stunned her audiences. Each performance became both triumph and burden, for to live such passions upon the stage was to consume oneself nightly, to burn through body and voice as though offering them upon an altar. Sarah, frail in health as always, bore the strain with a strange delight, as though she welcomed the exhaustion, the fainting, the collapse that sometimes followed her performances. It was the price of art, and she seemed to embrace it willingly. Perhaps in the extremity of her roles, she found the very intensity of life she craved, the proof that she existed not in moderation but in fire. Her legend grew not only through her art, but through her very presence. She dressed unconventionally, wore her hair in wild styles, and cultivated an aura of eccentricity that blurred the line between role and reality. Audiences leaving the theater spoke not only of the play but of Sarah herself, of her strange beauty, her audacity, her refusal to be ordinary. In every gesture she seemed to declare that life itself was theater, and she its supreme actress. And yet, for all the applause, there remained critics who found her excessive, too strange, too unlike the serene models of classical grace. They called her unnatural, even grotesque. Some muttered the word Monstre sacré, the sacred monster. It was meant as both insult and awe, capturing the contradiction she embodied, divinity and monstrosity, beauty and disturbance, a force both adored and feared. Sarah herself seemed to delight in the phrase. To be monstrous was to be unforgettable, and she would rather unsettle than vanish. Thus the divine monster was born, not by her own proclamation, but by the uneasy awe of those who watched her. The name clung to her as tightly as the scent of candle wax had once clung to her dresses. From this point forward, Sarah-Bernhardt was no longer merely a young actress finding her way. She was a phenomenon, a storm, a figure who would shape not only her century, but the very idea of celebrity. As the final applause of one evening faded, she lingered backstage, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath still uneven from the passions she had summoned. The theater was nearly empty, the candles burning low, the dust of the stage rising faintly into the air. She stood alone, listening to the echoes of her own voice, the ghostly resonance that seemed to linger even after silence had returned. It was in these moments, when the applause was gone and the audience dispersed, that she confronted the strangeness of her gift. Was she herself, or only the sum of her roles? Was she living, or merely performing the appearance of life? The applause still roared faintly in her ears, fading into the night air as she stepped out into the darkened streets of Paris. It was a sound she would chase across continents, a sound that would one day shake the theaters of London, New York, and beyond. But for now, it lingered in the quiet air, a promise and a burden both, fading into the night like a wave retreating from the shore. The applause still lingered faintly in her ears as she walked through the streets of Paris, its echo mingling with the night breeze. But applause, like perfume, fades quickly, leaving only the memory of its sweetness. For Sarah-Bernhardt, that fading was intolerable, and so she sought to surround herself with sounds, scents, and spectacles that would never let her existence fall into silence. If the theater made her divine, her life off stage would make her monstrous, for she could not live as others lived, nor did she wish to. She filled her days and nights with eccentricities that became as famous as her roles, weaving her legend not only upon the stage, but also within the strange theater of her private world. Her home became a menagerie, a place where animals of all kinds wandered freely, as though Paris itself had bent to her whims. She kept dogs and cats, of course, but also more exotic companions, monkeys, cheetahs, even an alligator that was said to have died of excessive champagne. Parrots shrieked in the rafters, lizards crawled along the walls, and turtles lumbered across her floor. Guests who visited often found themselves greeted not only by Sarah's luminous presence, but by the padded paws of a lion cub or the fluttering wings of rare birds. To some, it was madness. To others, a delightful curiosity. To Sarah, it was life itself, wild and unpredictable. Another performance where she was both ringmaster and spectacle. She spoke to these creatures as though they were confidants, feeding them delicacies, laughing at their antics, even mourning them with theatrical grief when they died. In their company, she seemed to find a freedom denied by the rigid salons and polite society that judged her so harshly. Animals, after all, made no demands of propriety. They lived instinctively, as she herself longed to live. And in their presence, she found a mirror for her own refusal to be tamed. Yet it was not only animals that marked her eccentricity. Her tastes in decoration were equally notorious. She filled her rooms with velvet draperies, gilded mirrors, oriental carpets, and curiosities gathered from every corner of the globe. Coffins, skulls, and funereal objects sat side by side with flowers and jewels, creating an atmosphere at once sumptuous and unsettling. Visitors felt as though they had entered not merely a home but a stage set, one where tragedy and comedy, life and death mingled inseparably. For Sarah, the boundary between art and existence did not exist. Everything was performance. Everything was theater. Even the arrangement of her furniture. Even the silence of her hallways. But among all her eccentricities, one stands apart, the one that has lingered longest in memory, the image that both fascinated and horrified, her coffin. It was not a prop for a play nor a relic inherited from another, but her own chosen bed of contemplation. In moments of weariness, she would lie down within it, as though rehearsing her final role. She claimed that it calmed her nerves, that it gave her rest, that it allowed her to meditate upon the brevity of existence. Others whispered that it was mere scandal, a deliberate provocation to unsettle and to fascinate. Yet those who saw her lying there described an eerie serenity. Her thin frame nestled against satin cushions, her luminous eyes half closed, her lips parted in the faintest smile, as though she had already made peace with the silence to come. Why did she do it? Was it morbid obsession, a lover's flirtation with death? Or was it merely another performance, a gesture to remind the world that Sarah-Bernhardt lived beyond convention, beyond comprehension? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps she found in the coffin the same paradox that shaped her art, the beauty of fragility, the grandeur of decay, the truth that life is most vivid when shadowed by its end. In lying within that coffin, she transformed death from an enemy into an accomplice, another player in the endless drama of her existence. The world, of course, reacted with a mixture of horror and delight. Newspapers reported it breathlessly, critics mocked it, admirers whispered of it with awe. Once again, Sarah had ensured that she was unforgettable, and if some condemned her for morbidity, she only smiled, for she knew that scandal, like applause, fades unless it is renewed, and she renewed it constantly, feeding her legend with every eccentric act. Her fascination with death did not end with the coffin. She painted scenes of skeletons and memento mori, posed for photographs in funereal settings, and spoke often of her desire to master the silence that waits for all. Yet even as she courted death, she burned with life. She threw herself into her performances with the same abandon, exhausting her body night after night, consuming her health with the fire of art. It was as though, by rehearsing death, she allowed herself to live more fully, as though each lie down in the coffin gave her strength to rise upon the stage with renewed passion. Those around her were not always charmed. Friends and colleagues sometimes grew weary of her excesses, her unpredictability, her endless demands for attention. Lovers, too, found themselves caught in storms they could not weather, but Sarah seemed indifferent to their weariness. She was not living to please. She was living to burn, and in that burning, she forged a legend that outshone their scorn. Imagine her then, in her chamber, surrounded by velvet and gold, animals prowling at her feet, a coffin waiting in the corner. The lamps burn low, casting long shadows on the walls, while outside, Paris hums with the restless energy of empire and war. She lies down upon satin cushions, her thin hands folded upon her chest, her breath steady, her eyes closed. To some, it is madness. To others, genius. To Sarah, it is simply existence, another act in the endless play that was her life. And when she rises from the coffin, when she opens her eyes and steps once more into the theater, her voice carries with it the shadow of that silence, the whisper of mortality. Audiences feel it, even if they cannot name it. They sense in her not only the brilliance of life, but also the nearness of death. And it is this paradox that makes her unforgettable. She is not merely performing. She is summoning the abyss itself, and in that summoning she reveals the fragility of all who watch. The coffin creaks faintly as she closes its lid once more, leaving the air heavy with the scent of velvet and lilies. That sound lingers, unsettling and unresolved, as though the stage of her life has grown darker, waiting for the next act to begin. The faint creak of the coffin lingered in the stillness of her chamber, like a hinge between silence and sound. Yet Sarah-Bernhardt did not remain enclosed in darkness. The world itself seemed to call her outward, across seas and continents, as though the boundaries of Paris could no longer contain the force she had become. And so she set forth, stepping beyond the city's stages, into the wide theater of the earth, her voice soon to resound in lands where her name was spoken with awe long before her figure arrived. Her first journeys beyond France came at a time when travel was not yet effortless. Ships creaked beneath the pressure of waves, their masts swaying against vast skies, their decks alive with the salt of sea spray and the cries of gulls. Sarah, delicate in body yet restless in spirit, boarded these vessels not with hesitation, but with eagerness. She had already conquered Paris, already startled Europe. Now she longed to test herself against the unknown audiences of the world. The stage, to her, was not bound by geography, but was infinite, as wide as the earth itself. In London, her arrival was heralded with fanfare. English audiences, skeptical at first of this French actress famed for scandal and eccentricity, found themselves disarmed by her presence. Her performance in Hernani left them stunned. Critics, who had prepared to dismiss her as a curiosity, wrote instead of her golden voice, her uncanny ability to transform silence into terror and desire into anguish. Londoners, accustomed to their own traditions of Shakespearean grandeur, recognized in Sarah something wholly other, a presence that seemed to transcend rules, a spirit that could not be contained. From London she pressed onward, her fame spreading like fire. Vienna, Berlin, Copenhagen, all received her with awe. In each city, her thin frame and luminous eyes became the subject of gossip, her voice the subject of reverent whispers. Painters sought to capture her likeness. Photographers begged for sittings. Writers praised and condemned her with equal fervor. She was not only an actress, but an event, her arrival in a city transforming its theaters into temples of worship. And then came America, across the vast Atlantic. The voyage was long, the seas restless, yet Sarah greeted it as though it were another stage, pacing the decks with the air of one rehearsing for an audience of stars and waves. When at last she arrived in New York in 1880, the city erupted with curiosity. Crowds gathered at the docks, jostling for a glimpse of the woman whose legend had preceded her. Newspapers printed daily accounts of her every gesture, from her meals to her attire, as though each detail carried the weight of prophecy. She was the first actress to be received not merely as a performer, but as a celebrity in the modern sense, her life itself a spectacle that enthralled the masses. Her performances in America drew audiences of unprecedented size. Theaters overflowed, ticket prices soared, and still people clamored to see her. In Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, she played to crowds that filled halls beyond capacity, their eyes fixed on the fragile figure who seemed to embody both angel and demon, saint and courtesan. She performed Camille with such intensity that women wept openly and men left the theater shaken. She played male roles with equal audacity, her Hamlet both haunting and revolutionary, challenging the very notion of gender upon the stage. Everywhere she went, she left not only admiration but controversy. Some praised her as the greatest actress the world had ever known. Others condemned her as indecent, a threat to morality. Yet none could ignore her. Her tours were not without hardship. Travel was exhausting, the strain on her fragile health immense. She often collapsed after performances, her body trembling with fever, her voice raw. Yet she refused to rest. Each new city, each new stage, each new roar of applause seemed to feed her spirit, even as it drained her strength. She lived on the energy of her audiences, burning herself for their illumination. In this way, she became both victim and victor of her art, sacrificing her body to the immortality of her legend. Everywhere she went, she gathered relics of her journeys, exotic fabrics, strange ornaments, animals brought across oceans. These she brought back to Paris, filling her home with the echoes of distant lands. Her chambers became not only a menagerie, but a museum of her travels, each object a reminder that her stage was the world itself. And in every corner of that world, her name left an imprint. Even in cities she never visited, stories of her reached the people, tales of the divine monster who lay in coffins and commanded kings. Her fame was a storm, sweeping across borders with the force of inevitability. She became the first actress to achieve truly international renown, her face known from Moscow to Havana, her name spoken in Cairo and Buenos Aires. In an age when travel was slow and communication limited, this was nothing less than miraculous. She had become not only a French actress, but a global myth. Her voice carried on waves of rumor and print to places her feet had never trod. Yet with this fame came solitude. Surrounded always by admirers, lovers, and critics, Sarah remained curiously alone. The greater her legend grew, the less she herself seemed visible. People no longer saw the fragile woman, the restless child of the convent, the uncertain novice of the Comédie-Française. They saw only the divine monster, the myth she had created and embraced. Did she ever tire of the mask, ever long to lay it aside? Or did she, like her coffin, find in the mask a refuge, a place where she could rest from the chaos of life? Imagine her standing on the deck of a ship, the masts swaying above her, the sea stretching endless on every side. Her hair whips in the wind, her thin frame cloaked in velvet, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind her lies applause, before her lies expectation. The ocean carries her not merely to another city, but to another performance, another act in the endless play of her existence. And as the wind whistles through the rigging, it seems to echo the applause of distant audiences, the roar that she chases and that chases her in turn. The ship groans softly, the masts creaking like giant coffins swaying in the wind. That sound lingers, unresolved, as though the sea itself has become a stage, waiting for her next performance to begin. The masts creaked above her as the ship moved steadily across the sea, their long timbers groaning like the slow opening of an ancient stage curtain. That sound lingered, unresolved, until it found its echo years later in theaters where Sarah-Bernhardt stood not only as woman, but as man. Her slender frame cloaked in doublet or uniform, her golden voice giving life to princes and heroes. The same daring that had led her to sleep in a coffin, to scandalize salons, to defy propriety, now carried her into roles that polite society declared impossible. She would not be confined by gender any more than by geography. The stage, to her, was not a mirror of custom, but a realm where boundaries dissolved. Her most famous defiance was Hamlet. The role, sacred in the English tradition, had long been considered the preserve of men, requiring the weight of masculine voice and stature. Yet Sarah stepped into it with the same audacity with which she had once struck a senior actress at the Comédie-Française. Dressed in the dark attire of the melancholy Dane, her thin frame became an asset rather than a weakness. She seemed spectral, otherworldly, embodying Hamlet's hesitation and haunted introspection in ways no broad-shouldered man could. Her voice, shifting from golden resonance to breathless whisper, captured the character's indecision, his dance between action and paralysis. Audiences were divided. Some were transfixed, declaring her Hamlet a revelation, a vision of the prince as fragile spirit rather than robust warrior. Others scoffed, declaring it indecent, grotesque, a woman's intrusion upon sacred ground. Yet none were indifferent. Once again, Sarah achieved what she most desired. She became unforgettable, forcing audiences to see not only Hamlet anew, but also the very question of what it meant to act, to embody, to cross the boundaries of flesh and role. It was not her only foray into masculine parts. She played Lorenzaccio, the tragic Florentine conspirator. She played Peleus. She embodied Napoleon's son in L'Aiglon, the sickly heir of an emperor whose shadow loomed too large. In each, she brought her peculiar mixture of fragility and fire, her thin body serving not as disguise, but as revelation. She was not attempting to become man in the crude sense, but to summon the spirit of these figures, to draw forth their weakness, their longing, their despair. She revealed that masculinity itself, when stripped of convention, was as haunted and vulnerable as any tragic heroine. This audacity unsettled her contemporaries, for it blurred the divisions upon which society relied. Gender, in the 19th century, was a boundary guarded with jealousy. To see Sarah step across it was to glimpse a freedom both thrilling and terrifying. For women, it hinted at possibilities long denied. For men, it raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of strength and weakness. Was power always masculine? Could fragility itself be heroic? Was the soul, in its torment and longing, truly bound to the body's sex? Sarah herself offered no explanations. She did not theorize, did not justify. She simply performed, allowing the scandal and admiration to swirl around her like smoke. Perhaps she understood that the questions her roles raised could never be answered by argument, only by the living truth of the stage. Each time she stepped into a man's costume, she declared by her presence alone that art is larger than flesh, larger than custom, larger even than the laws of society. Yet for all her daring, she did not abandon the great female roles. She played Camille, the courtesan dying of consumption, with such poignancy that audiences wept openly. She played Phèdre with the fury of forbidden love. She embodied Marguerite Gautier, Doña Sol, and dozens more, each time giving herself wholly to the fire of their passions. But by adding male roles to her repertoire, she expanded the very range of what theater could contain. She was not limited by category. She was limitless, a force that claimed every mask, every voice, every body as her own. The effect on her legend was immense. She became not merely an actress, but an enigma, a figure who refused to be contained. Painters captured her as Hamlet. Lithographs circulated with her image in doublet and sword. Photographs preserved her face beneath a man's cap. These images spread across the world, ensuring that her fame was not only theatrical, but visual. Her likeness fixed in the imagination of millions. Even those who never saw her perform knew her as the woman who dared to be man, the actress who claimed every role as her domain. But beneath the triumph lay cost. Each performance drained her frail body. Each controversy weighed upon her spirit. To embody Hamlet was not only to claim freedom, but also to inhabit melancholy itself, to breathe nightly the air of indecision and despair. To play L'Aiglon was to embody frailty, sickness, the tragedy of wasted youth. Sarah, already fragile, bore these roles as burdens as much as triumphs. Yet she seemed to embrace the burden willingly, as though the pain of her body and soul were necessary offerings to the god of theater. Imagine her then, On a stage in London or Paris, her thin figure clad in black, a sword at her side, her golden voice unfurling the words, "To be or not to be." The audience holds its breath, unsettled not only by the line but by the sight of her speaking it. Is it Hamlet who speaks, or Sarah, or some union of the two? The moment resists clarity. The distinction dissolves, leaving only the intensity of presence, the haunting of a question that has no answer. And when the play ends, when the applause rises, it is mixed. Admiration and outrage, reverence and condemnation. But Sarah does not need unanimity. She does not need approval. She needs only the roar, the murmur, the stir. She has once again ensured that no one leaves indifferent, that her name is on every lip, that her legend grows thicker with each controversy. She has become the divine monster, not only by her eccentricities, but by her audacity to claim what was forbidden. The sword she carried upon the stage clattered faintly as she set it aside in the dressing room. That sound lingered, metallic and unresolved, as though the blade itself awaited the next act, the next defiance, the next shadow to be summoned. The faint clatter of the sword lingered in the dressing room, a metallic whisper echoing against mirrors and velvet. But beyond the theater walls, another sound was rising, the march of boots, the rattle of weapons, the low thunder of cannons in the distance. The Franco-Prussian War had come, and with it, Paris trembled, its boulevards filled with soldiers, and its air thick with fear. Theaters closed their doors, chandeliers dimmed, and applause was silenced by the harsher chorus of war. For Sarah-Bernhardt, whose life had always been a stage, this too became a performance, though one written not in poetry, but in pain. When the Prussians surrounded Paris in 1870, the city entered into a long and bitter siege. Hunger gnawed at its people, cold pressed through shuttered windows, disease spread in narrow alleys. Sarah, who might have fled to safer ground, refused to abandon the city. Instead, she transformed the Odéon theater, her crucible of triumph, into a hospital for the wounded. The velvet curtains were taken down and used as blankets. The boards of the stage became wards, and the air that once carried verse now carried the groans of the injured. She herself moved among the soldiers, her slender figure draped not in costume, but in the plain garments of a nurse. With hands accustomed to gesture, she now touched wounds. With a voice accustomed to declaim, she now spoke softly to comfort. Those who saw her there spoke of her tireless devotion, her refusal to rest, her willingness to soil her delicate hands with the blood of battle. The divine monster of the stage became the angel of the ward, her eccentricities silenced by the immediacy of suffering. Yet even here, art and life blurred. Visitors to the hospital were struck by the theatrical quality of the setting, the dim lamplight flickering upon pale faces, the makeshift beds aligned where once actors had rehearsed, the echo of moans rising where applause had once fallen. It was as though Sarah had conjured a new form of tragedy, one that required no script. But unlike the stage, this performance demanded not feigned but real sacrifice, not metaphorical but literal blood. Her patriotism burned fiercely during these months. She wrote letters urging support for the French cause, raised funds through her network of admirers, and refused to soften her anger at those who surrendered too easily. To her, France was not merely a homeland, but a stage upon which she, too, had been born. Its fate was inseparable from her own, its defeat a personal wound. Even after the siege ended and the Commune brought fresh turmoil, Sarah remained, her loyalty unshaken, her presence a symbol of resilience. This chapter in her life revealed another dimension of her legend. She was no longer only an actress of fragile beauty and scandalous habits. She was also a patriot, a woman who had chosen hardship over safety, service over comfort. The press that had once mocked her now praised her, describing her devotion with reverence. Audiences, when theaters reopened, saw her not only as performer, but as heroine, a woman who had shared their suffering and carried their burdens. Her art gained new weight, her tragedies deeper resonance, for she had lived them not only upon the stage, but in the very marrow of existence. Imagine her walking through the ruined streets of Paris after the siege, buildings shattered, smoke still rising, silence broken by distant cries. She was frail, exhausted, her health weakened by months of labor, yet her eyes burned with the same fire as always. Around her, men stumbled in despair, women searched for food, children cried from hunger, and in the midst of this ruin, Sarah walked with the bearing of one who would not surrender, who carried within her the unbroken flame of hope. The war marked her indelibly. Though she would return to the stage with renewed passion, though her fame would soon carry her to greater heights, she carried with her always the memory of those wounded soldiers, of the blood-stained boards of the Odéon, of the cries that had once filled her ears. In every subsequent performance of tragedy, she seemed to draw upon these memories, lending to her roles a truth that art alone could not provide. When she played Phèdre's anguish, Camille's death, Hamlet's indecision, she summoned not only the lines of playwrights, but the shadows of those she had nursed, the silence of those who had died in her arms. And yet, for all its suffering, the war also nourished her legend. It showed the world that Sarah-Bernhardt was not merely eccentric, not merely scandalous, not merely a performer of fragile beauty. She was also a woman of courage, a citizen who had chosen to serve when she might have fled. Her devotion became another thread in her myth, binding her more closely to the heart of France. She had embodied her nation's tragedy as powerfully in life as she did in art. As theaters reopened, as Paris slowly rebuilt itself from ruin, audiences returned to see her, and their applause carried with it a new timbre. It was not only admiration for her skill, but gratitude for her loyalty. She was no longer only an actress, but a symbol, a woman who had lived through the city's darkest hours and returned to bring it light. Each ovation seemed now to echo not only from the walls of the theater, but from the wounded heart of France itself. The sound of a wounded soldier's sigh lingered in her memory, a fragile exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of life and death together. That sigh remained unresolved, echoing softly as though it might never end, carrying her forward into the next act of her existence, where tragedy and triumph would mingle once more. The sigh of the wounded soldier lingered in her memory, faint as a whisper of wind through autumn leaves, and it followed her when she returned to the stage. For Sarah-Bernhardt, such sounds could never be forgotten. They became woven into the fabric of her art, subtle threads that gave her performances their strange weight. When she stood beneath the glow of gaslight once more, audiences did not merely see an actress. They sensed in her something larger, as though she carried within her the shadows of war, the whispers of death, the sorrows of a city. And yet, she was not crushed by these burdens. She transmuted them, turning suffering into spectacle, memory into art, anguish into beauty. It was this alchemy, more than any role or technique, that defined her. Her style was unlike that of her peers. Where others sought polish, she embraced rawness. Where tradition demanded restraint, she let passion overflow. Her movements were sometimes wild, her gestures unorthodox, her voice trembling on the edge of excess. Yet in these very irregularities lay her power. She could summon silence more effectively than any other, stretching it until the audience leaned forward in breathless anticipation, and then shatter it with a cry so piercing that it seemed to tear through the air itself. She was not content to represent emotion. She sought to become its vessel, to let it seize her body as though she were medium rather than actress. Critics struggled to describe her. Some called her sublime, others grotesque. They noted how her voice could shift from golden resonance to a thin rasp, how her body seemed to dissolve into the role until she appeared half ghost, half flame. She was not realism in the narrow sense, nor was she mere artifice. She was both at once, the dream made flesh, the flesh dissolved into dream. Watching her was unsettling, for it was never clear where Sarah ended and the character began, where art ended and life intruded. She blurred the lines deliberately, making herself a paradox, a living riddle upon the stage. It was during these years that the phrase was spoken, le monstre sacré, the sacred monster. First uttered perhaps with unease, it clung to her quickly, for it captured what others could not name. She was divine in her brilliance, monstrous in her intensity, a creature at once adored and feared. The name delighted her. She wore it like a crown, embracing the contradiction as her true identity. To be monstrous was to be beyond measure, beyond category, beyond the ordinary bonds of woman, actress, or citizen. It was to be larger than life and closer to death, a being who lived at the very edges of human experience. Her performances during this period revealed the full shape of this identity. In Phèdre, she was desire itself, trembling, fevered, consumed by forbidden longing. In La Dame aux Camélias, she was Camille, dying with such fragile beauty that audiences wept openly. In Hernani, she embodied both grandeur and ruin, each line burning with intensity. Always she gave herself fully, burning her body for the sake of the role, collapsing backstage after ovations, her thin frame trembling with exhaustion. Yet she never faltered in her devotion. To her, the stage was not merely art, it was sacrifice, an altar upon which she laid herself nightly. Even her silences became legendary. Observers noted how she could hold the stage without a word, her body still, her eyes distant, the entire audience captured by her presence alone. It was as if she had discovered that the true power of theater lay not in speech, but in the tension before it, the breathless pause that made words unbearable in their absence. And when at last her voice broke that silence, it carried the force of revelation, as though the gods themselves had spoken through her. Her art was inseparable from her philosophy of life. Just as she slept in a coffin to rehearse death, so too did she treat every role as an encounter with mortality. She sought extremes, never moderation. For her, to live was to burn, and to act was to consume oneself entirely. She often said that she felt most alive when closest to collapse, most true when standing at the edge of the abyss. This philosophy unsettled those who sought balance, but it enthralled those who longed for intensity. Audiences sensed in her performances the truth of her creed, that art was not imitation but incandescence, the transformation of life into flame. Painters like Gustave Doré and Alphonse Mucha immortalized her, capturing her otherworldly presence in canvases and lithographs. Mucha's posters, swirling with color and form, turned her image into icon, half goddess, half phantom. Photographers, too, sought her likeness, their plates preserving her spectral beauty for a new kind of audience. Sarah understood instinctively the power of these images. She posed not merely as actress, but as myth. Her every gesture calculated to extend her presence beyond the theater, into the homes and dreams of those who might never see her in person. Thus she became one of the first to unite art and publicity, legend and commerce. Yet even as her fame expanded, she remained curiously enigmatic. Friends who knew her well spoke of her warmth, her humor, her generosity. Others described her as demanding, capricious, even cruel. Perhaps she was all of these, perhaps none. For Sarah herself lived as a performance, revealing and concealing, always aware that she was both woman and myth. To meet her was to enter a play, uncertain where truth ended and invention began. One cannot help but wonder, did she ever long for simplicity, for the quiet life denied her by her own legend? Or was she content to burn endlessly, even if the fire consumed her? The coffin in her chamber suggests the latter. For her, rest was rehearsal for the final act, and until that act came, she would not cease her performance. The flicker of gaslight on painted stage sets remained her true element. In that wavering glow, she moved like a spirit, casting shadows that seemed larger than life. The smell of dust, grease paint, and lamp oil clung to her hair and clothes, mingling with perfume and sweat, creating an atmosphere both sacred and profane. It was here, upon these boards, that she became eternal, her fragile body dissolving into presence, her mortal life expanding into myth. And when the curtain fell and the applause faded, the flicker of gaslight still trembled against the empty sets, a fragile illumination lingering in silence, as though the theater itself held its breath for her return. The flicker of gaslight trembled against empty stage sets, a fragile illumination lingering in silence, as though waiting for her return. Yet Sarah-Bernhardt did not belong solely to the stage as an actress. She was not content merely to wait for roles, to submit to managers, to let others determine the course of her destiny. Just as she had defied convention in her art and her life, so too did she defy it in business. In an age when women were expected to depend upon husbands or patrons, Sarah carved for herself a different path, one of ownership, command, and astonishing financial independence. She had learned early that applause, though intoxicating, could not fill a purse. Theaters were costly, managers fickle, contracts fleeting. To survive as an actress was always to balance upon a fragile wire, one misstep away from ruin. But Sarah, with her instinct for survival and her unquenchable ambition, refused such dependence. She negotiated her contracts fiercely, demanding sums that startled contemporaries, and often receiving them. She understood her worth, not only as an actress but as a phenomenon who could fill houses across Europe and America. Where others hesitated to claim value, she did so boldly, unashamed of being accused of greed, for she knew that her art deserved recompense, and her body could not endure endless sacrifice without reward. Yet mere negotiation was not enough. Sarah sought control. In the 1880s, flush with her triumphs and emboldened by her fame, she took the extraordinary step of leasing and eventually owning theaters in Paris. First the Théâtre de la Renaissance, later the Théâtre des Nations, which she renamed Théâtre Sarah-Bernhardt. She placed her name not only upon posters, but upon the very stones of the building. For a woman to do this was unprecedented. For Sarah, it was inevitable. She would not merely perform, she would command, direct, and shape the world of theater itself. Her management style was as audacious as her performances. She selected plays that challenged convention, often taking risks others would not dare. She employed actors of talent rather than pedigree, gave opportunities to playwrights whose works unsettled tradition, and insisted upon productions that bore her unique stamp. She poured her fortune into lavish sets, sumptuous costumes, and daring innovations. At times, her extravagance pushed her finances to the edge of disaster, yet she seemed to thrive on this peril, as though the constant risk of collapse mirrored the intensity of her art. Audiences flocked to her theater, not only to see her performances, but to witness the very spectacle of her enterprise. For in every detail, from the gilded proscenium to the playbills that bore her image, the theater proclaimed itself an extension of Sarah's being. She had become both priestess and temple, actress and manager, myth and merchant. In this union, she revealed herself not merely as artist, but as entrepreneur, a woman who could bend even commerce to her legend. Her business instincts were sharper than many credited. She recognized the power of publicity long before others did, and she exploited it ruthlessly. She arranged for photographers to capture her in costumes and poses that would circulate widely, ensuring that even those who never entered her theater would feel her presence. She sold souvenirs, posters, and photographs, transforming her image into a commodity that traveled across the world. She understood instinctively what the 20th century would make commonplace. That celebrity itself was a form of currency, as powerful as gold. This financial independence gave her freedom unknown to most women of her time. She could live as she pleased, love whom she wished, support her son without dependence upon any man. She purchased property, traveled the world, and funded her own artistic experiments. Critics accused her of arrogance, of extravagance, of reckless waste. Yet beneath these accusations lay envy, for she had achieved what few dared dream, mastery not only of art, but of her own fate. Yet independence did not shield her from hardship. The constant expense of maintaining a theater drained her fortune repeatedly. She was often forced to tour abroad to refill her coffers, traveling across oceans despite failing health, performing night after night, even when exhaustion left her trembling. Her determination to maintain control meant that she bore alone the burdens of failure as well as the glories of success. She risked ruin more than once, pawning jewels, selling property, yet always she recovered, as though fate itself could not extinguish her. The theater she owned became both sanctuary and battlefield. Within its walls, she created masterpieces, but she also fought bitterly with critics, actors, and rivals. She was demanding, perfectionist, often harsh, yet those who endured her temper spoke of her generosity, her loyalty to those she trusted, her willingness to sacrifice for her art and her company. Like a monarch, she ruled with both fire and grace, inspiring devotion and fear in equal measure. To walk into the Théâtre Sarah-Bernhardt during her reign was to enter her world. The foyer gleamed with gold, the air filled with the mingled scents of perfume and lamp oil, the chatter of fashionable society mingling with the whispers of students and dreamers. The curtain rose not only on plays, but on Sarah herself, for her presence infused every detail. Even when she did not appear on stage, her spirit hovered in the air, a reminder that this was not merely a theater, but an extension of her being. Coins clinked in the box office, steady and metallic, reminders that art and commerce were inseparable. That sound echoing through the marble halls was as much a part of Sarah's legend as the applause of audiences. For she had understood long before many others that survival required mastery not only of performance, but of business, that the golden voice must be matched by the golden coin. And as the coins clinked, their sound lingered, unresolved, faint against the marble and velvet, as though waiting for the next act, the next risk, the next sacrifice. The metallic clink of coins in the box office lingered, sharp and cold against the velvet hush of the theater. Yet money, like applause, has a way of vanishing swiftly. For Sarah-Bernhardt, fortune was never steady, always flowing like water through open hands. Her extravagance was notorious. Jewels bought on whim, exotic animals fed delicacies, costumes embroidered with gold thread, journeys across seas undertaken at the faintest whisper of opportunity. She spent as quickly as she earned, as though wealth were merely another form of applause, fleeting and intoxicating, meant not to be hoarded, but consumed. This pattern, admired by some and condemned by others, fed the endless stream of scandals that accompanied her, staining her name as brightly as her triumphs adorned it. Her love affairs, too, became sources of gossip and reproach. Sarah did not choose discreet companions, but rather figures who themselves carried drama. Aristocrats with obligations elsewhere, artists with tempestuous tempers, men who admired her fire but could not endure its heat. These relationships often ended in bitterness, leaving behind torn letters, unpaid debts, or public quarrels. Yet she did not conceal them. On the contrary, she seemed to revel in the exposure, as though every scandal were another act in her lifelong play. Critics accused her of recklessness, of shamelessness, of leading men to ruin. But Sarah moved on unrepentant, her hunger for experience greater than her fear of condemnation. She was accused often of excess, too much passion, too much spending, too much daring, too much of everything. Her rivals called her greedy, egotistical, impossible. Some even declared that she had become enslaved to her own legend, unable to live, except through extremes. But perhaps this was true of her from the beginning. Moderation had never been her gift. She lived at the edge, whether in art, in love, or in life itself. It was this intensity that made her magnetic, even when it left ruins in her wake. One story often repeated concerned her menagerie of animals. The alligator fed champagne, the lion cub that wandered her hallways, the parrot that shrieked in the midst of rehearsals. All these became symbols of her extravagance. Newspapers reported them with equal parts amusement and disdain, painting her as a woman intoxicated by her own strangeness. Yet behind the ridicule lay fascination. For every critic who mocked her, there were 1,000 admirers who thrilled to her audacity. She gave them a spectacle not only upon the stage, but in every corner of her existence, and they could not look away. Broken hearts littered her path. Some lovers begged for her return, others cursed her name. Still others faded quietly into obscurity, unable to bear the weight of her absence. Yet Sarah herself seemed less affected. She loved fiercely, but she loved freedom more. No man could contain her. No bond could restrain her flame. She was not cruel deliberately, but she was inexorable, moving always forward, leaving behind a trail of sorrow as she pursued the next passion, the next role, the next thrill. These scandals fed the press, who never tired of writing about her. They called her a courtesan of genius, a divine monster, a woman who consumed love and money alike. And yet, with every accusation, her fame only deepened. The public could not resist her contradictions. Saint and sinner, angel and demon, mother and temptress, artist and merchant. She embodied all of them at once, and in doing so, she became larger than any single image could contain. But the cost was real. Beneath the surface of triumph, Sarah often struggled with debt, her fortune drained by extravagance and mismanagement. She pawned jewels, borrowed heavily, and relied on relentless touring to replenish her finances. The physical toll was immense. The emotional toll, less visible, but equally heavy. Friends worried about her health, about her isolation, about the way she burned herself ceaselessly. Yet Sarah would not slow. To pause would be to fade, and fading was the one fate she would not accept. Her independence also bred enemies. Other actresses envied her dominance. Critics resented her power. Rivals accused her of arrogance. Some whispered that she was destroying the very dignity of the theater by turning it into a marketplace for scandal and spectacle. But Sarah dismissed them. To her, theater was always spectacle, always life and death played out upon the boards. If her legend overshadowed her art, it was because her legend was itself art, a living creation as intricate as any role she ever performed. There is a question that lingers. Did Sarah create her scandals deliberately, or did they arise simply because she lived without restraint? Perhaps both. She knew instinctively that scandal was another form of publicity, another way to remain unforgettable. But she also could not live otherwise. Restraint was foreign to her nature, moderation impossible. She burned brightly, recklessly, magnificently, and the flames inevitably scorched those closest to her. One imagines a lover's letter, torn in half and left unread upon a table in her chamber, the ink smudged, the words unfinished. The paper trembles in the draft from an open window, a fragment of a heart discarded without ceremony. That image lingers, unresolved, as though love itself had become another performance, another scene played once and then abandoned, leaving only silence and fragments behind. The torn letter trembled in the draft from the open window, its edges fluttering like the wings of a wounded bird. That faint, unsettled motion seemed to mirror the fragility of Sarah-Bernhardt's body as she entered the later decades of her life. For all her fire, for all her defiance of custom and scandal, she was not invincible. The years of unrelenting travel, the strain of endless performances, the collapse after curtain calls, the sleepless nights surrounded by animals and admirers, all exacted their toll. Illness crept upon her like a shadow at dusk, silent but inexorable. And though she fought it with the same ferocity she gave to every role, it claimed her body piece by piece, beginning with her leg. The trouble began with injuries sustained during her tours, compounded by exhaustion and the relentless demands she placed upon herself. She ignored pain, dismissed weakness, refused to rest. For Sarah, to pause was to wither, and so she pressed on, even as her knee swelled and her movement faltered. Doctors urged restraint, urged surgery, urged caution. She resisted as long as she could, until at last the pain grew unbearable, and the truth could no longer be denied. In 1915, when she was already in her 70s, surgeons amputated her right leg. For any ordinary actress, this would have marked the end. To lose mobility, to bear such a wound, seemed incompatible with a life upon the stage. But Sarah-Bernhardt was no ordinary actress. She accepted her condition not as defeat, but as another role, another trial through which her legend could blaze. She refused crutches and wheelchairs when she could, preferring instead to stand with dignity, to move as best she could, to command the stage not with steps, but with presence. And if she could no longer stride, she would sit upon a throne-like chair, her golden voice rising all the same, her eyes burning with undiminished fire. Audiences were astonished to see her, frail and wounded, still performing with such passion, such authority, seemed nothing less than miraculous. They whispered of her courage, of her refusal to yield, of the way she transformed even disability into drama. Critics called her indomitable, a heroine not only of theater, but of life. Some confessed that her performances in those years carried a deeper truth than ever before, as though suffering had carved new depths in her art. For when she spoke of anguish, of longing, of death, she spoke not only as actress, but as one who had tasted them in her own flesh. She herself never spoke of weakness. When asked about her missing leg, she would laugh, dismiss the subject, or even jest. She would not allow pity, for pity was contrary to the myth she had created. Instead, she wore her wound as though it were another costume, another emblem of her sacred monstrosity. If she had already rehearsed death in her coffin, then what was a mere amputation? She lived as though nothing could diminish her, as though the very act of survival were another ovation. The image of her on stage in those final years is haunting. Draped in rich costumes, seated or standing with careful poise, she spoke lines that filled theaters with the same intensity as before. The audience, knowing her condition, felt the weight of each gesture, each syllable. When her hand trembled, they saw not weakness, but the strain of endurance. When her voice cracked, they heard the echo of real pain. She had become her roles completely, embodying tragedy not only through artifice, but through the scars upon her body. And still she toured. Against the advice of doctors, against the pleas of friends, she traveled to foreign cities, across seas and borders, carrying her flame to audiences who longed to see her before the end. Each journey risked her health, each performance drained her strength, yet she pressed on. Perhaps she knew that time was short. Perhaps she could not imagine life without the stage. Or perhaps she understood that her legend demanded such sacrifice, that to stop would be to betray the very myth she had built. Her resilience inspired as much as her art. In a world where women were still confined by expectation, where illness was often hidden away, Sarah stood boldly before the public, wounded yet radiant, broken yet unyielding. She revealed that fragility and strength could coexist, that even a body diminished could house a spirit vast enough to fill a theater. In doing so, she gave courage not only to actresses, but to all who saw in her the triumph of will over fate. One can imagine the sound of her wooden prosthetic striking the boards of the stage, a dull thump beneath the flow of her voice. That sound, faint but unmistakable, was like the heartbeat of her final performances, a reminder that art is born from pain as much as from beauty. The audience, hearing it, would fall silent, their attention sharpened, their admiration deepened. For Sarah had turned even her wound into music, even her loss into spectacle. And when the curtain fell, when she returned backstage exhausted, trembling, perhaps even faint, she would smile faintly, as though satisfied that once again she had defied the impossible. The stage had not defeated her. Illness had not silenced her. Death itself would have to wait. The thump of the prosthetic lingered as she left the boards, echoing softly in the darkened theater, a sound unresolved, like a drumbeat carrying her onward to the next act of her extraordinary life. The thump of the prosthetic lingered in the boards of the theater, a muffled drumbeat echoing long after she had withdrawn into the shadows of the wings. That sound, so human, so vulnerable, might have broken another's legend. Yet for Sarah-Bernhardt, it became part of the myth. Audiences did not turn away. They leaned closer, entranced. And soon that thump, that fragile step, was carried into a new dimension, one not bound by the fleeting air of performance, but by the permanence of image. For Sarah was among the first to understand that theater need not vanish with the closing curtain. Art could endure in pictures, in posters, in the new and uncanny flicker of film. Her presence, once confined to the fragile frame of her body, now spread into the mechanical veins of modernity, ensuring her immortality in ways even she could scarcely have imagined. The artists of her time became her collaborators in legend, most famously Alphonse Mucha, whose long, swirling lines and ethereal forms transformed Sarah's likeness into icon. His posters for her plays, Gismonda, La Dame aux Camélias, Lorenzaccio, did not merely advertise. They enshrined. He painted her as saint, as goddess, as warrior, as dream, her slender frame surrounded by halos of gold, her features elongated into archetype. These images flooded Paris, pasted upon walls, sold in shops, collected by admirers. Soon Sarah's face was known not only to those who had seen her perform, but to countless others who gazed upon the posters as though upon holy relics. She was quick to understand their power. She gave Mucha his chance, and in turn he gave her visual immortality. Together, they fused art and commerce in a way that reshaped theater's relationship with the public. For Sarah, the poster was not a mere announcement. It was another performance, another costume, another mask. It carried her presence into the streets, into homes, into the very eyes of strangers who might never set foot in her theater. She became not merely an actress, but an image, endlessly reproduced, endlessly desired. Photography, too, extended her reach. She posed willingly, often extravagantly, for photographers, her body draped in silks, her hair unbound, her gaze fixed with that peculiar mixture of fragility and command. The photographs captured not only her costumes, but her aura, the strange sense that she was more than flesh. Some show her reclining in her coffin, serene, as if rehearsing eternity. Others display her as Hamlet, sword in hand, her face sharp with melancholy. These images circulated widely, printed on postcards, collected in albums, exchanged as tokens. Audiences who had never heard her golden voice could nonetheless hold her likeness in their hands. It was as if she had foreseen the age to come, when celebrity would live as much through image as through deed. She courted photographers, allowed journalists into her private chambers, fed them stories of her eccentricities. Every scandal, every gesture, every possession, whether lion cub, coffin, or jeweled gown, was carefully woven into her self-presentation. She was not only an actress, she was the architect of her own myth, a myth built not merely on performance, but on the careful shaping of perception. And then came the cinema, still new, still uncertain, flickering like ghost light upon small screens. Sarah embraced it with the same daring with which she had embraced scandal, war, and coffin. In 1900, she appeared in a short film of Hamlet, the dual scene captured in the jerky rhythm of early motion pictures. To later eyes, the film is crude, her gestures exaggerated, the quality faint. But at the time, it was extraordinary. The most famous actress in the world stepping into a new medium, her presence captured not in memory or image alone, but in movement, in voice soon to follow with the invention of sound. She performed again for the camera in La Tosca and other works, her art condensed into minutes yet still potent. Audiences marveled to see her not only on stage, but on screen, as though she had been multiplied, her ghost able to haunt countless halls simultaneously. For Sarah, film was not a threat to theater, but an extension of it, another way to conquer time and space, another mirror in which her myth could be reflected. She was among the first great actors to recognize its potential, and in doing so, she ensured that fragments of her presence would endure even for those unborn in her century. This mastery of image was no accident. Sarah understood that art alone, however sublime, fades when confined to memory. By embracing poster, photograph, and film, she secured her permanence. She transformed herself into icon, into brand, into legend carried upon paper, silver, and celluloid. Others might act brilliantly, but they vanished when the curtain fell. Sarah endured, her likeness multiplying, her myth expanding beyond the fragile limits of flesh. Yet one must ask, did she ever feel lost in this multiplication? Did she, gazing upon Mucha's luminous posters or a photograph of her own face, feel estranged from herself? Or did she delight in the distance, the blurring of woman and image, of actress and icon? Perhaps she had long ceased to distinguish between them. She had always lived as performance, always blurred art and existence. To become poster, photograph, film, was this not simply the natural continuation of her life's design? In these images, one notices always her eyes, luminous and distant, as though gazing beyond the moment, beyond the century. They seem to know something we do not, to carry a secret both alluring and unsettling. Perhaps it is the knowledge that she had already conquered death in one sense, that her likeness would endure long after her body faltered. Perhaps it is only the reflection of her own endless hunger, the restless desire to be seen, to be remembered, to be immortal. The flicker of early film reels spinning fills the air, soft and mechanical, like the whirring of a strange new heart. That sound lingers, unresolved, carrying her forward into the next act, where her golden voice itself would be preserved, haunting the world long after silence claimed her lips. The flicker of the film reel spun softly, its whirring like the pulse of a strange new heart, and from that mechanical breath came not only her image, but at last, her voice. For Sarah-Bernhardt's voice had always been her most sacred possession, the golden thread that bound audiences in silence, the instrument that critics struggled to describe yet never forgot. It was said to shimmer with tones both rich and sharp, at once angelic and otherworldly, capable of breaking into whispers that chilled the air or soaring into cries that pierced the marrow. And though voices of the stage usually vanish with the last vibration of air, hers was among the first to be caught by the fragile magic of recording. Imagine the scene: a darkened room, a cylinder turning upon a phonograph, the horn trembling as though it bore the breath of a ghost. Sarah, thin and frail, leans toward it, her lips forming words of Racine, Hugo, or simple verse. Her voice pours into the machine, etched upon wax by invisible hands, a miracle of science that promised to outlast flesh. Those who heard the playback described it as uncanny, the actress's presence, absent yet near, her tone diminished by the imperfections of technology, yet still carrying its peculiar resonance. It was as though her spirit had been trapped in the grooves, a phantom voice wandering in endless circles. These early recordings are faint, fragile, distorted by time. Yet listen closely, and the essence remains. One hears the measured cadence of her speech, the strange color that set her apart, the intensity that no device could fully contain. She sounds distant, like a figure calling from across a valley, but even so, the listener feels a shiver. For here, preserved in brittle wax, is not merely sound, but aura, the trace of a presence that once held nations spellbound. Her contemporaries spoke endlessly of that voice. Some said it was metallic, others compared it to the tolling of bronze bells. Still others called it golden, luminous, unearthly. It was not smooth, it carried peculiar vibrations as though shadow clung to its edges. But therein lay its power. It unsettled, it disturbed, it broke the polished clarity of convention. When she spoke, words seemed not merely spoken, but incarnated, given flesh and spirit. Her voice was not instrument alone, but revelation, the summoning of something deeper than meaning. She used silence as much as sound. Audiences trembled when she paused, when her lips stilled, when her gaze fell to the ground. In those moments, her voice seemed to linger in the air even after it ceased, as if echoing within the very bones of the listeners. And when she spoke again, the release was overwhelming, a surge of sound that broke the spell of stillness. She mastered not only the spoken line, but the unspoken, turning silence itself into part of her performance. The power of her voice was inseparable from her philosophy of art. Just as she believed in living at extremes, so too did she believe in speaking at the edge of collapse. She pushed her tones beyond comfort, into the places where they cracked or trembled, for there she found truth. She did not aim for beauty alone, but for intensity, for the vibration that unsettled the soul. Critics called it excessive, grotesque, even monstrous, but audiences wept, gasped, and shuddered, unable to resist its pull. It is fitting that her voice, so haunting, should be among the first to escape the prison of time. Those wax cylinders, those fragile discs, carried her into the future as surely as Mucha's posters and early films did. She became a ghost, not only in image but in sound, whispering across decades to ears that had never seen her in life. Even now, to hear her is to sense the shiver of mortality, the strange closeness of a woman who lived more than a century ago, her breath still vibrating faintly in the air. Did Sarah herself sense the strangeness of this preservation? Did she, listening to her own voice replayed by a machine, feel wonder or unease? Perhaps both. She was fascinated by death, yet here was a form of survival she could not have rehearsed in her coffin. Her voice, detached from her body, became an immortal fragment, circling endlessly in grooves of wax. Perhaps she smiled, knowing that she had once again defeated silence, once again ensured her presence where absence should have reigned. In these recordings, faint though they are, we hear not only the actress, but the enigma. The timbre, unlike any other, reveals why she was called both divine and monstrous. It is a voice that comforts and unsettles, that caresses and wounds, that reminds us that beauty lies as much in imperfection as in clarity. It is the voice of a woman who lived always at the edge, who burned herself nightly upon the altar of theater, who carried within her both life and death. The phonograph needle scratches softly as it circles the wax, a fragile sound like the turning of time itself. That scratch, faint and unresolved, lingers even after the voice fades, carrying her forward into the next act, where her philosophy of death and her obsession with mortality would find their most haunting expression. The faint scratch of the phonograph needle circled in the grooves, like time itself turning endlessly, even after her voice fell silent. That fragile sound seemed to belong not to the living, but to the threshold of the grave, a reminder that Sarah-Bernhardt had always courted death as both companion and muse. For her, mortality was not a terror to be hidden away. It was a truth to be embraced, rehearsed, even performed. Just as she wore jewels with boldness and played Hamlet with audacity, she carried her coffin into salons and chambers, displaying it as one might display a prized painting. It was not a mere object of curiosity, but a symbol, a stage upon which she could contemplate the inevitability of her end. From her youth she had lain within it, her body slender upon satin cushions, her hands folded, her gaze turned upward as though already gazing through the veil. To her critics it was a grotesque spectacle, evidence of morbidity, proof of her monstrous eccentricity. To her admirers, it was another act of genius, a defiance of fear, a gesture that transformed even death into theater. To Sarah herself, it was both comfort and provocation. She said that the coffin soothed her nerves, that it allowed her to rest, that it reminded her of the brevity of existence. Perhaps she also knew that it unsettled others, that it drew their gaze more firmly upon her, fixing her in their imagination as one who dared where others trembled. The coffin was not only a bed of rest, but a stage of reflection. Within its stillness, she confronted the paradox that had shaped her entire life, that to live fully is to live close to death, that intensity is born not from denial, but from acknowledgement of the abyss. She rehearsed eternity night after night, so that when her final curtain came, it would not catch her unprepared. For Sarah, death was not an enemy but an accomplice, a partner in her art, lending to her performances their peculiar gravity. When she cried out as Camille dying of consumption, when she whispered as Phèdre consumed by forbidden desire, when she trembled as Hamlet before the question of existence, she drew upon her own intimate dialogue with mortality. Audiences felt it, even if they did not understand. They sensed that she spoke not only from imagination, but from a place already shadowed by the grave. She surrounded herself with symbols of death as naturally as others surrounded themselves with flowers. Skulls adorned her rooms, funereal draperies hung beside exotic fabrics, lilies wilted in vases beside bright roses. Death was never hidden in her presence. It was woven into beauty, as if she wished to remind all who entered that life and decay are inseparable, that fragrance and rot are bound together. Guests sometimes recoiled, unsettled by these juxtapositions, yet Sarah seemed to delight in their discomfort, as though saying, "Here is the truth you deny. Here is the reality you mask with convention. Here is the destiny you cannot escape." And yet, despite her familiarity with death, she burned with an intensity of life that few could match. This was her paradox. She rehearsed death, spoke of it often, surrounded herself with its symbols, and yet lived with a ferocity that seemed to deny it. Perhaps it was precisely this intimacy with the grave that gave her such energy. For knowing that each breath is fragile, each hour uncertain, she refused to waste them in moderation. She spent her life recklessly, extravagantly, gloriously, because she knew that it would end. Death gave her urgency, gave her brilliance, gave her fire. Her fascination with death also deepened her spirituality. though it was never bound by dogma. Raised in convent halls, she had tasted the solemn rhythms of prayer, yet she never confined herself to the church. Her faith was theatrical, expansive, filled with visions of eternity that blended art and religion. She spoke of the soul as if it were another character, another mask, another role to be embodied. When she lay in her coffin, she seemed to converse with eternity as one might converse with a lover, intimate and unafraid. This philosophy unsettled many. For most, death was silence, absence, the void. For Sarah, it was spectacle, presence, the next act. She spoke of it not with dread, but with curiosity, as though eager to know what performance awaited beyond the curtain. Was this bravado, a mask to conceal fear, or was it genuine serenity, born of a lifetime rehearsing the silence? No one can know, but the image remains. Sarah-Bernhardt, the most famous actress of her age, lying serenely in a coffin by choice, her eyes half closed, her lips curved in the faintest smile, as though eternity itself had been transformed into her audience. The smell of lilies lingered in her chambers, heavy and sweet, mingling with the dust of velvet curtains and the faint musk of animals. That fragrance, both beautiful and mournful, carried the presence of funerals even into the midst of her glittering life. It clung to her gowns, to her hair, to the air around her, until admirers wondered whether they breathed theater or tomb. But perhaps for Sarah there was no distinction. To live was to perform was to die a little each night, and death itself was only the last, longest performance. The lilies, pale and fragrant, drooped slowly in their vases, their petals falling one by one upon the dark wood of her coffin. That image lingered, unresolved, as though time itself paused in the heavy air, waiting for the next gesture, the next breath, the next act of her endless drama. The lilies drooped in their vases, their pale petals loosening one by one and falling soundlessly upon the coffin's dark wood, like the slow passing of hours. That silence, fragrant and heavy, was soon broken by a harsher sound. The bugle's call, sharp and distant, summoning men not to theater but to battle. For once again war came, sweeping across Europe in the final years of Sarah-Bernhardt's life. The Great War, more terrible than the siege she had endured in her youth, shook the earth with its endless thunder, and in its shadow Sarah found yet another role, not upon the boards of Paris, but in the hearts of soldiers who longed for courage amid despair. By the time war erupted in 1914, Sarah was already frail, her leg amputated, her health fragile, her body marked by decades of sacrifice to art. Yet she refused retreat. Where others sought safety, she sought service. She traveled to the front lines, not as a nurse, as she had been during the Franco-Prussian War, but as an actress carrying words to men who faced death daily. She performed in makeshift stages, in barracks, in open fields, her thin figure wrapped in shawls against the cold, her golden voice rising above the murmur of cannons. Soldiers who had never seen Parisian theaters, who had only read her name in newspapers or seen her face on posters, now found her before them, fragile yet unbroken, speaking lines of hope and defiance. They called her La Grande Sarah, the Great Sarah, and they wept and laughed in her presence. She brought them fragments of art, moments of humanity amid mud and blood. Her voice, though weaker than in her youth, carried with it the authority of one who had lived long and suffered much. When she spoke of courage, they believed her. When she recited lines of love, they remembered their own beloveds waiting at home. When she whispered of death, they knew she understood, for she had rehearsed it all her life. In these acts, she revealed once more her strange philosophy, that art is never luxury but necessity, that even amid war and ruin, beauty must be summoned, voices must be heard, stories must be told. She gave herself to the soldiers not with the perfection of her earlier triumphs, but with the sincerity of her frailty. They saw in her not an untouchable goddess, but a woman wounded, yet still burning. And in that image they found courage for their own wounds. Her patriotism was fierce. She spoke passionately in support of France, condemning its enemies, urging resistance, refusing despair. Her words circulated in newspapers. Her presence became symbol as much as solace. To see her, old yet indomitable, lifted spirits not only among soldiers, but among civilians who felt their strength failing. She'd become more than an actress. She was now a living emblem of France itself, scarred but unyielding, fragile yet undefeated. Those who accompanied her in these journeys described extraordinary scenes. Sarah, helped onto a chair by companions, would sit with regal poise, her face pale but her eyes alight. She would begin to speak, and silence would fall among rough, weary men. They leaned forward as though before a sacred rite, hearing in her voice the echo of something greater than themselves. Sometimes she recited Racine, sometimes Hugo's, sometimes simple poems of comfort. Always she gave herself fully, as though each performance might be her last. When she finished, applause rose not with the refinement of theaters, but with the raw thunder of gratitude, boots stamping, hands clapping, voices crying her name. It is said that in those moments she appeared transfigured. Her frailty vanished, her missing leg forgotten, her age dissolved. She became again the divine monster, commanding, radiant, a flame burning against the darkness of war. And yet, when the applause ceased and she withdrew, her body trembled, her breath faltered, her strength nearly spent. Still, she smiled, for she had done what she always longed to do, to give herself utterly, to live fully, to burn brightly even in ruin. The Great War deepened her legend even further. Newspapers across the world wrote of her devotion, her courage, her refusal to surrender. She was hailed not only as the greatest actress of her age, but as a symbol of endurance itself. The divine monster had become the sacred mother, carrying her people through darkness. And yet she never abandoned her eccentricities, never ceased to surround herself with symbols of death, never stopped rehearsing eternity in her coffin. Her service in war did not erase her strangeness, it transfigured it. For the very woman who courted death was now the one who gave courage to those who faced it most closely. Imagine her in the cold dawn, a bugle sounding faintly in the distance, soldiers preparing for another march into danger. She sits upon a chair, her cloak gathered around her, her voice carrying into the chill air. Her words rise like fragile banners, shimmering, trembling, yet defiant. The soldiers listen, their breath steaming, their eyes fixed upon her as though she were more apparition than woman. And when she finishes, when her voice falls silent, there lingers not despair but strength, as though her flame had passed into them. The distant bugle calls again, sharper now, summoning men to return to their duty. That sound, piercing and unresolved, carries into the silence that follows, lingering like the last note of a song that will not end. The distant bugle's call pierced the air, fading slowly until only silence remained. And in that silence, Sarah-Bernhardt lived out her final years. The war had scarred France, had scarred Europe, and it had left its mark upon her as well. Her body, already fragile, weakened further, her health uncertain, her strength diminished. Yet the fire within her refused to die. She continued to perform even when her doctors begged her to rest, even when her friends implored her to retreat into quiet. For Sarah could not imagine a life without the stage. To her, existence and performance were inseparable. Without theater, she would not merely fade, she would cease. In the last years of her life, she appeared often seated, her missing leg concealed by gowns or supported by chairs, crafted to resemble thrones. Yet the audience scarcely noticed her immobility. Their eyes, their hearts, were captured by her presence, by the undimmed light in her gaze, by the resonance of her voice, now softer but still golden, still strange, still capable of piercing silence. She had long since abandoned the pursuit of technical perfection. What she gave instead was essence, distilled and haunting. When she spoke a line, it carried not only the words of the playwright, but the weight of a life lived at its fullest intensity. Her final performances bore the melancholy of farewell, though she never declared it so. In Aiglon, in La Dame aux Camélias, in fragments of Racine recited for soldiers and civilians alike, she seemed to embody not merely characters, but the very passage of time. Her frail figure, crowned with fire in her eyes, became a living symbol of endurance, of beauty persisting through suffering. Audiences watching her often wept before she spoke a word, moved simply by her presence. They knew they were witnessing not only art but history, not only a role but the last embers of a legend burning against the encroaching night. Paris adored her still. Crowds gathered at the theater doors, eager for one more glimpse, one more chance to hear her. The newspapers followed her every step, her every gesture, reporting with reverence upon her courage, her resilience, her refusal to yield. She had become something beyond actress, beyond scandal, beyond even celebrity. She was a national treasure, a symbol of France itself, wounded, enduring, beautiful, even in decline. Her home, filled with relics of past travels, with coffins and animals, with posters and photographs, became a kind of shrine. Visitors described the atmosphere as otherworldly. The mingling of perfume and dust, the sight of exotic beasts wandering through gilded rooms, the coffin still present, waiting, as though rehearsals for eternity continued, even as the final performance approached. Sarah received guests with the same mixture of warmth and imperiousness that had always marked her, telling stories, laughing at her own frailties, refusing pity. She seemed to exist already half in this world and half in the next, her body failing, but her spirit burning, restless, immortal. And yet there were nights of weariness, moments when the pain grew heavy, when her body trembled under the strain of living. In those hours she lay back among her pillows, her gaze distant, her voice reduced to whispers. Did she think then of the convent bells of her childhood, of the scorn of the Comédie-Française, of the triumphs at the Odéon, of the roar of applause in New York and London? Did she remember the lions and parrots, the lovers who had come and gone, the son she had raised, the soldiers she had comforted? Perhaps all these memories mingled within her like shadows and flames, inseparable, unresolved. For even in her frailty, she seemed never fully present. She was always both here and elsewhere, always both mortal and myth. Her very decline became another act, another scene in the long performance of her life. She transformed even her fading into art, turning her weakness into a spectacle of endurance. Audiences admired not only the brilliance that had once been, but the courage that remained. In 1922, she gave what would be one of her final performances, fragments of plays performed for soldiers in the aftermath of war. She was carried onto the stage, her body frail, her leg gone, her strength nearly exhausted. Yet when she spoke, her voice rose with undiminished fire. Those present described the moment as unforgettable. The divine monster, wounded and near her end, still commanding silence, still summoning awe. The applause that followed was less celebration than farewell, a collective recognition that they were hearing the last echoes of a golden voice. Her final years were lived in twilight. She spent more time at home, surrounded by friends, family, and the strange relics of her legend. She continued to pose for photographs, to grant interviews, to preserve her image for the future. She seemed to sense that her body would soon fail, but her myth, carefully crafted over decades, would endure. She laughed at her own fragility, dismissing sorrow as though already reconciled with the silence that awaited her. Imagine the theater at the end of a night's performance, the chandeliers dimmed one by one, the velvet seats empty, the stage bare. Only a faint glow lingers like the last ember of a fire, refusing to go dark. That ember was Sarah-Bernhardt in her final years, frail, diminished, yet still radiant, still burning with a light that refused extinction. The stage lights dimmed, one by one, until only a single lamp glowed faintly against the boards. That faint glow lingered, unresolved, awaiting the silence of the final act. The stage lights dimmed one by one, until only a single lamp glowed faintly against the bare boards, its fragile flame trembling as though reluctant to depart. That faint glow mirrored the final days of Sarah-Bernhardt, when her body, worn by decades of excess, illness, and unrelenting devotion to the stage, could no longer carry her forward. She had outlived almost all her contemporaries, had seen wars, revolutions, and empires fall, had crossed oceans and astonished continents. Now she rested at home in Paris, surrounded by relics of her long performance, posters, photographs, jewels, and the coffin that had so long been her companion. Her son Maurice remained at her side, along with friends and admirers who came to pay homage, sensing that the last curtain was near. Even in those final days, she remained Sarah, refusing pity, laughing at her frailty, speaking with flashes of the fire that had never left her. She spoke of new projects, of plays she might still attempt, of journeys she might yet make, as though death itself could be delayed by the sheer force of her imagination. She received visitors as though still on stage, her hair arranged, her eyes bright, her gestures theatrical. Yet beneath the surface, her strength ebbed slowly, like a tide receding from the shore. On the night of March 26, 1923, the final curtain fell. Sarah-Bernhardt, the divine monster, the sacred flame of the stage, breathed her last in her Parisian home. She was 78 years old. Outside, the city paused, as though aware that something more than a woman had departed. Paris had lost not only an actress, but a symbol, a myth woven into its very heart. News of her death spread swiftly across France, across Europe, across the world. Newspapers printed her name in bold letters, accompanied by images of her younger self, her roles, her eccentricities. For days, the press was filled not with politics, but with remembrance, as though the world itself had become an audience mourning its brightest star. Her funeral was unlike any the city had seen. Tens of thousands lined the streets of Paris to witness her final procession. Soldiers, artists, statesmen, and ordinary citizens stood side by side, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed upon the cortege that bore her body. Her coffin, once the subject of scandal when she lay in it by choice, was now borne with reverence through the city she had enthralled. Flowers covered it, their fragrance mingling with the air of spring, as though Paris itself offered tribute. Crowds wept openly, their grief mingled with awe. For in her death, as in her life, Sarah-Bernhardt had transformed reality into theater, turning the streets into her final stage, the people into her last audience. She was buried at Père-Lachaise Cemetery, among poets, musicians, and artists, in the company of those who had shaped the soul of France. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage, visited by admirers from around the world who left flowers, notes, and prayers. Even now, a century later, her name draws visitors who whisper of her legend, who imagine her voice lingering among the tombs, who recall the divine monster who dared to sleep in her coffin while alive and thus seemed almost to welcome her eternal rest, What remains of Sarah-Bernhardt is not only the faint crackle of wax cylinders or the flicker of early film reels, not only the gilded posters of Mucha or the faded photographs of her in regal costume. What remains is a legend, a presence, a myth that transcends time. She was not perfect. Indeed, she was excessive, scandalous, contradictory. She spent recklessly, loved recklessly, lived recklessly. But in that recklessness lay her brilliance, her refusal to accept mediocrity, her insistence upon burning brightly no matter the cost. She revealed that art is not neat, not measured, not restrained, but a fire that consumes and illuminates at once. One may ask, was Sarah-Bernhardt truly an actress, or was she something greater? She blurred the boundary between role and reality so completely that her life itself became her greatest performance. Each scandal, each triumph, each eccentricity, each act of courage was part of the vast play she performed for nearly 8 decades. In this sense, she did not merely play characters. She became character itself, the embodiment of theater as a way of life. Her coffin, her animals, her lovers, her wounds, her patriotism, her voice, all were woven into the single seamless performance of Sarah-Bernhardt. And what of her obsession with death? Did she find peace at last after so many rehearsals? Did she greet eternity as an old friend, smiling faintly as she lay back into her chosen coffin? Or did she, even then, long for the applause that only the living can give? These questions remain unanswered, like so much of her legend, suspended between truth and myth, between history and dream. Imagine for a moment the silence of the theater after her passing. The stage is empty, the chandeliers extinguished, the seats vacant. Yet in that silence there lingers something, an echo of a golden voice, a glimmer of eyes that once held audiences captive, a faint scent of lilies, velvet, and dust. The silence is not absence, but presence, as though she still waits in the wings, as though she might step forward once more, slender, radiant, unyielding. And so her story ends, not with finality, but with unresolved silence, the kind she mastered so well upon the stage. The divine monster has left, yet she remains. In posters, in recordings, in memory, in myth, Sarah-Bernhardt continues to live, defying death even as she embraced it, burning still in the hearts of those who whisper her name. The unanswered silence lingers, heavy and eternal, leaving us to wonder whether we have reached the end, or only the pause before another act.